Hello, my name is Tim Osborne, and welcome to the 2021 Qualtrics Users Conference. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. Again, my name is Tim Osborne, and we are going to be working on best practices for conducting internal audits using an assessor's approach. And I want to also thank those at A2A Workplace Training for allowing me to do this presentation on your behalf. So, one of the things we're going to talk about today is understanding how to do a proper approach for performing audits and focusing on training you a little bit on how to perform those audits and how to generate those findings, which we will define later on in the presentation, and how non-conformances are documented. And we're going to do this in the eyes of the assessor. So we're going to be coaching you to help you perform better in your own internal audits and be successful to hopefully reduce some of the non-conformances that you have or may have in your companies. The second module we're going to cover is looking at 3 of the top 10 A2A nonconformities, and these are nonconformances that are identified during A2A assessments over the last couple of years from 17025. So what we're going to do in this strategy is we're going to review the requirements from 17025, evaluate the context of the organization. We'll talk about that. We'll define that word for you a little bit later. And then look at it in the eyes of the assessor and how we train assessors to gather findings, analyze them, and evaluate them for conformity and nonconformity, and how we write nonconformances. And we'll do this all within an hour. And then we'll identify what objective evidence an assessor would be looking for to witness to make sure that they have, 1, provided enough information to make a decision on conformity, and 2, to help the conformity assessment body, which may be you, to ensure that you are resolving those things to a level that reduces the likelihood of another nonconformance later on down the line. All right, so with that, we're going to talk into Model 1 right now, and that is on training and coaching auditors and assessors. So one of the things I'd like to have you think about is that most of you that are viewing this webinar have been assessed by an accrediting body, audited by a certification body, audited by a customer, or maybe even your own internal audit team, or maybe you're just new to it. But for a moment, I want you to consider the best and the worst of these experiences. And then think about what those attributes were that made or broke that audit experience for you. In some cases, it might have felt like an interrogation, which is never a good thing. And in other cases, it might have felt like, hey, this was a great learning opportunity. I really learned a lot from this assessor or auditor. But at the end of the day, the closing meeting and the issuance of that final report is what really burns in our memories the longest, or at least until all the nonconformances have been addressed and the accrediting body or the certifying body is giving you a check plus smiley face. You are now accredited or recertified for the next 2 or 4 years, whatever that looks like. But thinking about that and looking at those situations where things didn't go so well is typically around nonconformities. And so in this webinar, we're going to focus on nonconformities. One is gathering the evidence, making sure there's sufficient evidence that you're evaluating it against the criteria, there's a good checks and balances there, and that you're providing that objective evidence, assembling it, identifying the nonconformity as part of the finding evaluation, and then providing that report to you. The goal here is to equip you to think like an assessor. That means look at what the standard says. What does it exactly say? What does it require of me? Or what does it require of the conformity assessment body when you're looking at it in the eyes of the assessor? And balancing against what the standard says or other requirements like A2A, ANAB, NAVLAB, IAS, PJ Labs, whatever company that you represent from an accrediting body perspective. And then making sure that we're bringing those requirements in and evaluating against those requirements and not putting my own spin on what I think those requirements are, and providing that information to you directly to help you to build, improve your processes, but also equip you to do that when you're becoming your own internal auditor for your organization. All right, the bottom line here is making sure that the auditor, the assessor, or you demonstrate conformance as you're gathering objective evidence by focusing on the facts and not opinions. Opinions are plentiful, but rarely are they factual. At least they're factual with the information that you have and not necessarily all of the information that's available to you. Audits and assessments are a fact-finding mission. They're not witch hunts. And if you've got an auditor that is on a witch hunt, and I can tell you from my own experience, I've had plenty of them, auditors and assessors, they don't make for a fun event. And I always look at when I'm teaching or auditing or assessing, I want to make it a learning experience, not only for them, but for me as well. And that is a good attribute of an assessor, is coming out with a level of humility. I'm saying I'm not ultimately humble. I'm not. But what I'm saying is that approaching assessments with a level of humility always goes a long way. All right. Now, opinions are fact. Well, let's dissect this a little bit. How do you differentiate that? Well, it can be said that it takes two to have an argument, right? Unless you're one of those unique people that has discussions with him or herself, and you can argue your way into a tizzy. But that's not where we're going here. The bottom line here is dissonance, especially during assessments, comes when one or more parties disagree with an opinion and interpretation, like with the standard, understanding, or an approach with one another. Okay, some people think this is a best practice, and that is countercultural to an organization that you're doing assessments or audits for, and you have to be able to balance this. Like I said earlier, this is where humility and objectivity, or if you put it in the words of 17025, this is where impartiality should reign. Okay, when all parties are seeking the best for the customer, there should be little to no personal bias involved in that, especially with auditors. Okay, you have to remove yourself from the emotion of what's going on and focus in on what is best for the customers. And we'll talk a lot about that in the balance of this webinar. Assessors and auditors should be trained to shelve biases when performing their respective activities. Again, this is not a witch hunt, this is fact-finding. And try to learn from the organization itself, especially if the differences arise out of an opinion and not out of ignorance. All right. As an assessor and auditor, my job is to understand what drives the organization, the culture, so that I can see from their lens, as best I can in the amount of time allotted, what their approach is to their business and how they address risks and opportunities and ultimately nonconformances. So how do we get that objective lens? Well, as requested for this presentation, many people ask to understand how an assessor would evaluate an organization or interpret the standard. And we'll discuss a little bit about how that is taken on as part of the instructional part of this here in a few minutes. The most significant struggle for training internal auditors comes from their lack of experience. Until you've gone through a lot of these, it's like riding a bicycle. Until you've scraped your knee, bumped your nose, whatever. Hopefully you didn't break anything when you were learning. That is truly the best way to do it. My instruction or somebody else's instruction isn't going to help you do that, except to help you to take those first couple of steps. So with that, most internal auditors typically have one frame of reference. That is their own from their own laboratories. And they bring all that with them. And so what I've seen typically when I've gone to assess laboratories or consult with laboratories that are trying to build their program is that some people that move from their company, within their company, and moved over into quality, they already know where all the witches are or all the skeletons in the closet. And they think, oh, I'm a quality, I'm going to start writing up nonconformances, and that way management will help me to get these things resolved. Well, what you've now done is you've introduced bias or partiality to the equation. And that, I'm just telling you now, if that's of your ilk, that it's not going to go well for you. So, so what ends up happening is now they think, like I said, you can fix the problem. But in many cases, what they've done is they've ultimately been groomed the way the organization thinks. And even then, sometimes what they do is they can't get outside of their own box. And so they keep repeating the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, which might lead you to that first part about having discussions with yourself. And so it's important for you to make sure that you try and remove yourself from it. Sit back, look at what the standard says, and parse it out and say, what does the standard require of me? What does A2A, A and AB, the accrediting body require of me? What does the regulator require of me? And this is touching on the point of context of the organization. What is it that drives the way that your business runs, is shaped, and drives the culture in it? So you're looking at external influences and internal influences that drive the context of your organization. Okay? Okay, and so one of the things that new auditors do is they don't have another frame of reference by which they're making decisions. And so sometimes going to forums like the Qualtrics Users Conference, going to things like NCSLI and other trade shows to see, like ASQ, to see how other people approach looking at these standards differently will help you bring fresh ideas into your company to help reduce these nonconformities and help you to become better internal auditors. So, what I'm going to do is provide as much detail as possible within the hour of this session, but you need to understand that even though I'm providing some level of direction and coaching to you during this webinar, it's not exhaustive. Okay, there are lots of opportunities for training outside of this webinar that I would encourage you to take. So there are ways of addressing many of the items in the standard, is what I'm trying to say. And assessors and auditors, one of the things that I teach on that is making sure that it's not always what you see that is happening behind the scenes. And you have to be ready to see how somebody else has interpreted the standard when you're moving into that space. Okay, so first thing out of the gate is understanding what assessor/auditor responsibilities are. And the first and foremost is being ethical, which includes all 6 of these things that are lying around this hexagon in the middle, right? Impartiality, competence, consistent, thorough, punctual, and factual. And what's interesting about this is that if you look at 17025, the conformity assessment body, which may be you, is required to adhere to these 3 scope items. So if you were to look in section 1 of 17025, you'll see that that laboratories shall act impartially, have competent staff or personnel, and provide consistent results. And so that is a responsibility of an assessor or an auditor as well, is to bear those 3 things in addition to the other 3 that are sitting over there on the right of this. Now, 17025, if we take a look back at what impartiality it says that the laboratory shall be, an organization that acts impartially, that it manages and addresses commercial and financial strains, that these undue pressures do not cause people to make decisions that would affect the consistency and maybe even the competency of the staff that's making measurements in your conformity assessment body, or inspections, or certification claims. Okay, and in it also requires a management's commitment to that, and typically that will show up in a quality policy or something like that, that you're demonstrating commitment. Now, what I always teach in the 17025 class and the other conformity assessment standards is that management's commitment to managing risks to impartiality is getting accredited, right? Because anybody can declare that I'm the best, right? But until somebody else tells you that you're the best, you're not. And so that's what managing risks to impartiality will do for you. So impartiality is a risk identification and a mitigation tool, as is the rest of 17025 and the other conformity assessment standards. Now, speaking of other conformity assessment standards, the ISO IEC 17011 is the Bible, if you will, give me that lateral for the accrediting bodies. And the accrediting bodies are assessed or peer evaluated, if you will, to this standard. And so you see, I'm not going to go through this entire list, but you can see that risk, at least from the working group's perspective for the accrediting bodies, was more significant and is addressed in many more clauses in section 4.4 of 11 that talks about risk management to a much greater level. So what I want you to understand is that it is the accrediting body's interest to make sure that they're acting as fairly as possible to remove as much bias, which is why they have these assessor training courses. And there's a whole section in 17011 that talks about assessor training. And then the regional cooperations like APAC, the Asia Pacific Accreditation Cooperation, IAAC, the Inter-Americas Accreditation Cooperation, and ILAC, which most of you probably know, which is the International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation, which covers all of those regional cooperations, also have additional policies and procedures, more correctly policies that focus in on these risks and that you're managing them. So it is very important for you to understand what's going on here. Now, what I highlighted here is that this area is congruent both in 17025, 17020, 17034, 43, 65, 15189. All these conformity assessment standards all have these things that are being managed in them. So rest assured that that is a flow down requirement, if you will, from not only the accrediting bodies, but also from the ISO standard 17025 itself. Now, the the assessor's success is based on good ethics, okay? Now, ethics and morals are two different things. We're only talking about ethics, okay? So these 7 items here are key and pivotal. And part of the assessing the competency of assessors or auditors should include an assessment of these 7 attributes, both from an initial hiring or an initial move into the auditor assessor role to the ongoing evaluation monitoring of these assessors or auditors. So integrity is extremely important, as is fair presentation, making sure that you're gathering enough objective evidence to demonstrate conformance or non-conformance, that do professional care. That means there's respect and humility going on between the auditee and the assessor/auditor, that they're maintaining confidentiality, that they're not posting it on Facebook or Instagram or any of these kinds of things, and they're maintaining confidentiality within the organization itself. For example, if an assessor came in and saw me making a bad measurement, they don't go, well, Tim Osborne made a bad measurement. You know, they say, it has been demonstrated that, you know, staff did not perform this particular process in accordance with method ASTM method E18 or whatever it might be. Okay, making sure that there's independence where it's possible. 17025, even for a one-person laboratory, doesn't really talk about internal auditing and yourself, because you can do it. The only place it talks about going outside of yourself is when dealing with complaints, that you have to, at some part of it, you have to bring somebody else in to manage it if that risk is significant enough. And I would encourage you to read section 7.9 on that. And then evidence-based approach. Like I said, it's not about opinions, it's about facts. And it's important for them to sample and come up with a sampling plan to ensure that they collect enough objective evidence based on risk-based approach, which is the next icon there on the right, to make sure that enough evidence is collected in the areas that are important, that are impactful to the customer, the external customer, and even those internally. We can't forget about the internal customers there either. Okay, so assessor ethics, fair presentation, and that's what we're going to focus on, because you can spend probably a week in discussing the other ones, but the fair presentation is what we're looking at here. This is gathering, you know, looking at the processes, looking at the records that are generated as a consequence of those processes, making sure that you've done enough sampling, objective sampling to make sure that you're getting a representative number of pieces of evidence to come up with a conclusion, to evaluate the conclusion on that objective evidence against certain criteria, which would be the quality management system itself, 17025, the regulations like 21 CFR or 10 CFR, maybe the T&I standard for some of you who may be, subject to the T&I requirements, or AOAC requirements, or the ASCLD requirements, depending upon where you're coming from. And then coming up with a final report. Now, invariably, there will be obstacles that will come your way. Something will come up that takes you off the path. Either there was a clear nonconformance there and you're trying to establish a systemic issue or not, or is this a one-off thing? You get those where, and I'll tell you a brief story, my first assessment when I was with A2LA, and most of you who know me, I'm a very intimidating person. I'm just being joking, but I just walked up to a young lady and was introduced myself, and I said, I'm here to witness this measurement. She turned around and cried and ran out of the building, and I didn't see her for the rest of the assessment. Now, hopefully that wasn't my overbearing personality, but I don't know. But invariably, you will get situations where the customer just breaks down, they're hyper nervous, or you have a CEO that gets angry and doesn't want any nonconformances and will argue left, right, and center. Those things will come into play, and that's where fairness and humility and everything else, you can agree to disagree. All these things come in, and they will put a wrinkle in the timeliness of getting your audit or assessment done. However, you cannot let those obstacles impact the findings that you're collecting and your assessment of the conformity, which is the audit finding. Okay, is it conforming or non-conforming? Now, there will be, unfortunately, unresolved diverging opinions. I've been on a number of assessments, I've done on a number of audits where you have to agree to disagree and let the accrediting body be the arbiter, if you will, or, and if it's an internal audit, then letting management figure out whether or not it's divergent or you can resolve that. And a lot of it has to do with communication. So that leads us to our last point, which is making sure that if you're observing something and you collect the evidence for it, that you actually are understanding the process before you cite that nonconformance. And sometimes asking clarifying questions, the who, what's, where, when's, why's, and how's, in order for you to ascertain whether or not you have indeed a negative finding or a positive finding or conformance. So communication is key in this industry. Now, in order to evaluate the laboratories successfully, you have to understand the objectives. Now, the audit or the assessment has objectives, but the laboratory also, or the conformity assessment body, also has its own objectives. And so in order to do that, you need to understand the context of the organization. And I promised you at the beginning we would talk about the context of the organization. And that is basically all those influencers, those stakeholders that drive and shape the way the organization performs. Okay? Meaning, if you were to look at most conformity assessment bodies, you have the management itself is part, will set the objectives. The people that you work with in the quality organization will help shape the organization, as well as the people that are actually performing the processes, because they know what they're doing with those processes. That's internal stakeholders. Now we've got the external ones, the people that influence the results, like industry. Okay, in the example, if we were to pull back and say, an external influencer was COVID-19, that shaped and reshaped a lot of organizations, right? And so it changed the way companies did. Some companies were in automotive had shifted over to making ventilators. Some people that were into making paper and paper products and cotton products shifted to start making masks. Okay, so objectives can change from external influences. And then the FDA has regulations on masking. The CDC has regulations on this. The EPA has releases on effluents to the environment, into the waste, into the drinking water, the wastewater, the soil, the air. Okay, those help shape it as part of the industry. And then you might have investors in your company that want to make sure that you're achieving your objectives. And then, of course, last but not least, you have the accrediting body. And each of them have their own requirements, and they measure you against those requirements. Those are what objectives are. It's a measurement. Okay, similar to what you're probably doing in your company, is measuring things. And so what they're looking for is a specific result to be delivered. And those results come in the form of KPIs, or key performance indicators, like turnaround time or failure rates, or maybe you're looking at control charts, right? You want to make sure that you don't have, I was just speaking with a lady in another laboratory a couple of weeks ago who was clamoring because she had 4 successive increasing results between the 2 sigma and 3 sigma line, and was wondering what she should do and how to troubleshoot that. Control charts are another mechanism for defining objectives. Everything, for those of you who are 17025 accredited, in section 7.7, which talks about internal and external quality control measures, or ensuring the validity of results, to put it in the vernacular of 17025, all have key performance indicators tied to them. And so those are objectives from the organization. Now there are objectives for the auditor or the assessor, and those are to get in and get out in a timely fashion, but gather enough information to determine whether or not the conformity assessment body conforms to the standard, which means you don't want that assessor to be there, like when I was in the Navy, they would be there for 2 weeks evaluating you. The Navy's one thing, but when you're generating revenue, that's a different story. So they typically have to be in within a day to 3 or 4 days, or a team of assessors to come in to make sure that those objectives are being met. Now, as an internal auditor, it is your responsibility, or your program manager or laboratory director, quality director, manager, whatever that title might be, is to make sure they engage with the executive management to find out what the objectives are with respect to the management system that you're deploying, and making sure that you're measuring the success against that. It may be the number of complaints, the turnaround that you receive, and corrective actions, the number of nonconformances during an assessment or an internal audit. All of these things may have objectives tied around those. So as an internal auditor, there are specific objectives that you have to meet as well. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of that. So the first thing you have to do is establish those objectives, and objectives are basically established based upon risk in the laboratory. So this is that whole risk management thing that we're talking about in the new release of 17025. It's not quite so new anymore. It's almost 4 years old now. But make sure that when you establish objectives, they're SMART. That means they're specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. Okay. We offer a course on that kind of stuff. You can take that another time. But when you consider objectives, you think of measurement. What is it I'm measuring? And the only time management or your stakeholders require an objective to be presented is if it's a risk to them, a positive risk or a negative risk. So if I want to make sure that I'm making more money than I'm costing the company, that is a measurable called profit and loss, right? And so that is an objective that I'm looking at on a monthly basis. An objective would be to have an internal audit performed every year. That's specific, it's measurable, it's timely, and all that kind of stuff. That is an objective for doing internal audits. But objectives are set to reflect and support the laboratory's objectives to serve the customer. Okay? And the basis for the objectives, it means, is there a need and an expectation from stakeholders? A requires you to pass an assessment in order to receive your accreditation. BVI or TUV or whoever it is that you're certified through for 9001 has needs and expectations, as is those that I mentioned earlier. The people in the laboratory have a need and an expectation that the people in receiving will process that sample, right, that they receive from the customer, will label it properly and store it properly so that the laboratory can do it. So you have internal objectives and external objectives. The management system has requirements. External providers have requirements. Your vendors have requirements of you, making sure that you provide them flow down requirements from your customers to them, and you're clear on your purchase order, what you need from them to do. And then you have certain key performance indicators that you assign to that. And that's all based upon risks and opportunities. If it's not that critical to your organization, it's not a risk that you're willing to put processes in place for. And 17025 gives you that lateral. The CFRs give you that lateral as well, and sometimes they take some of that lateral away. All right, and then Where you come in, if you're in quality assurance and quality control, pardon me, as an internal auditor, you will look at the results of previous audits to determine whether or not you're going to increase the frequency of the audits, decrease the frequency, cite additional nonconformances, and so on. So what your job is, in order to demonstrate those expectations are being met, is your job is to collect objective evidence. Okay? That means that you're looking at processes, and the outcomes of those processes are records, one form or the other, or a demonstration of something that you can witness. So, for example, if I were to put a placard on the restroom door that had the shape of a man, you know that that man will go into that room, and the outcome is that he will use the proper restroom, right? And so you can have processes in place that don't necessarily require a record, but you expect an outcome from it. And so those areas in 17025 and the other conformity assessment standards and regulations and statutory requirements are, if it's important and it requires you to document a procedure or a program or a plan and so on and so forth, that you tie objectives around that to ensure its success so that you can measure it. And then you put auditing activities around it to make sure that you check those at a frequency to ensure you're not putting the customer, those that have those expectations put upon you, are being met. Now, to summarize that, objective evidence is part of the fact-finding mission. Okay, so any audit requires that when you're demonstrating somebody is conforming to a particular clause in a standard or a regulation, that it is backed by objective evidence. That's how you demonstrate conformance in that space. And so when you're an internal auditor, the first thing you do is you identify what does the stakeholder require. So A2A, ANAB, all the accrediting bodies have source documents. And as an internal auditor, you are going to audit against those source documents. You will collect samples, whatever those might be. I'm going to witness that all of the uncertainty documents are based on ILAC P14. Okay? And so you will collect evidence, measurement uncertainty budgets, to make sure that all the components from ILAC P14 are being met. You will evaluate those budgets against the criteria, and you'll record the findings. The findings being, yay, they conform, or nay, they do not, which means they have a nonconformity. You review those to make sure that you've established that you have enough objective evidence, and you draw conclusions and you provide those in your report. So, what happens when something seems wrong, but you really can't put your finger on it? Is it really wrong? Is it an opinion you have, or do you have to go down another path? Well, your job as an auditor or in the assessors is to seek additional information. This gets back to the one host and 5 wines thing. Some people call it one husband, 5 wives. I'd prefer to go to the one host and 5 wine opportunities. Okay, just got back from France and plenty of wine, so that's where that came up. But your job is to find out what additional information, and if you, just to use the wine example, you know, if you, or beer or liquor or whatever it is you like to do, is you ask about certain attributes of it to determine whether or not you're going to want to do it. So the same thing happens in 17025 and the other conformity assessment standards and the ISO 9001 based documents as well. Is you have a document. In 9001 they call it documented information, which kind of spans anything that generates anything, basically. And so in 17025 specifically, they talk about terms like you need to define something, documented process, a manual, quality objectives. These are all documents, whether they be forms or something like that, that is a process, in which case you apply some level of action to it to generate a record, okay? And so I'm not going to go into all the different words here, but that's the logic that assessors use. If it says you shall have a procedure for determining competency of staff, well, one, I need to see the procedure that you determine how you determine competency, and then I want to see you carry that through by the hiring of somebody and all the way through 6.2.5, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. but there should be some sort of record that accompanies it. And typically, if you go through 17025 and the other conformity assessment standards, I typically go through and highlight different areas that require some sort of document, and then a different color, those that require a record. Now, what becomes problematic in 17025 and other conformity assessment standards is that when they use what a gentleman whom I respect would call weasel words, okay, or words that give you a little bit of room to wiggle out of something, okay, because there are two ways to do it. People will approach it as, hey, here's my get out of jail free card, or others will say, no, I've got some ability to apply things using a risk-based approach and do it where I see it's necessary. Okay, so there are these phrases in there that start off with when or where. And so it's when applicable, when appropriate, available, where possible, where practicable, where relevant. Okay, now I'm going to caution you in this particular area because while 17025 may give you this wiggle room, the accrediting bodies might put a little bit tighter noose on you in those specific areas, or the regulations may require it. That's why the context and understanding the context of the organizations is extremely important for you when you're serving as an assessor or an internal auditor. So make sure you're always keeping that in the back of your mind. So now that we're looking at the standard and we're looking at processes, there is a process for audit findings, and I'm going to reveal this to you in this webinar. Now, some of you who are 9001 or have taken some of the courses that we provide, you have seen this diagram before, this plan, do, check, act cycle. Well, it's very similar in audit findings in that you have a plan, excuse me, to identify, to gather the sources of information and identify what that objective evidence is going to be. You then analyze that objective evidence and evaluate it against the criteria, and you report on those findings, whether it's conformant or not conformant. It's just that simple, okay? Now, just as a reminder, the number one rule of assessments is if you cannot express the nonconformity in the words of either the requirement, period. Okay, if that requirement is a management system standard, if it's a regulation, if it's a technical method or specification, if it's your own policies and procedures, if it's the accrediting body's policies and procedures, whatever they might be, okay, if I can't look at the reference, which is one of these specifications or requirements, it could even be a contract, right, from a customer, and I gather objective evidence, I measure that objective evidence against that requirement. So when I'm writing a nonconformity, I state the reference, I state the objective evidence in there clearly so that those who have to respond to it can do it accurately and they can address the real problem. Your job is to define the problem as best you can in the shortest amount of time possible. It's a difficult balancing situation, but that is your responsibility. Okay? So if you can't do that, then you do not have a nonconformity. Okay? So the question is, well, what happens if you have a single point failure? Well, if you have a single point, for those of you that took any level of geometry or algebra in elementary or junior high or high school, you'll know that a single point has an infinite number of ways it can go from it. Okay? So you can't really establish direction on it. But when you have 2 points, okay, now I can establish a direction because I can establish a trend. And if you looked at 17025, it talks about where trends are detectable. That's why trends are important, because you can make decisions, risk-based decisions off of trends. Now, when it comes to nonconformities, there are two camps that you can have. One of them is acceptable and the other one is not acceptable. Which one do you think it is? Well, I don't think it requires a rocket scientist to figure that out. Subjective nonconformances are never fruitful for anybody. If nothing else, that will be a source of frustration, similar to what I was opening up with at the beginning of this webinar. Okay? Nonconformities can be subjective, or they should not be subjective, but I see them often that way. And I've reviewed some of those nonconformances that A2LA provided to me. Mind you, all the people and the confidentiality was protected. So for those of you that were probably worrying about that, all I was looking at was the actual verbiage of the nonconformance and what clause they were. And so when you see words like, or phrases, records were insufficient, okay, well, What do you mean they were insufficient? Describe that to me. I can go any number of ways. But if you say records were not available at the time of the audit or the assessment, well, then that means it could be a document control issue, or it could be an ignorance issue on the person that you asked the question. Then there's lack of competence. There's, if I were to write a non-conformance, says lack of competence in Tim Osborne's laboratory, well, that doesn't really help me understand what's not competent. So it's important to specify competence requirements were not met in accordance with ASTM E18, blah, 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 blah. Taking it away from the individual, putting it back on the process. The procedure does not ensure. That is one of those weasel phrases that I was telling you about. Rather than the procedure does not include. Okay, if in 17025 there are a couple of places where it says the procedure shall ensure something, means the outcomes have to achieve that objective, but how you get there is up to you. If the standard says the procedure shall include, like 6.2.5, then you have to include all 6 of those areas to make sure that that's being met in 17025 and in your management system. All right, so here's an example. This is a good example of a nonconformance. So the criteria, remember I said that you have to point to the reference. Here we have the references being procedure 111. The finding is the laboratory has not implemented its procedure for protection of customer confidentiality when customers visit the lab. Okay, that was the objective evidence that we gathered. Now, there could be some improvements there, but we'll leave it there for now. The objective evidence was the auditor observed several customers, again, keeping confidentiality in place there, in the laboratory while unrelated customer work orders were displayed openly on the laboratory benches. That means Tim went in and saw company ABC's records, and guess what? Tim's a competitor to ABC. So what makes this a good conformity? Well, there is criteria, a finding, and objective evidence. It's a clear statement because it's a clearly written finding and a detailed description of the objective evidence. So this is a non-conforming work, this NC on the top left. Otherwise, it would be conformant, and it would show up in a checklist accordingly. All right, now let's step into Module 2. So now we're going to look at 3 of the top 10 non-conformances that A2LA has identified in the last couple of years. So the first one is equipment records, and just so that you understand, it says here in 6.4.13 that records shall include the following, where applicable. There's one of those weasel phrases I was talking about. The identity of the equipment, including software and firmware version. B, the manufacturer's name, type identification, serial number, and other kinds of unique information that separate it from other pieces of equipment. C, the evidence of verification that equipment conforms with specified requirements, and we're not going to get into explaining what all of these are. We're going to focus on the areas that are highlighted in green or with green font on them. D, the location. E, the calibration dates and intervals and adjustments and acceptance criteria and all that kind of fun stuff. F has to do with documenting reference materials and results of acceptance criteria. There is a non-conformance area. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But then G is the maintenance plan and maintenance carried out to date where relevant to the performance of the equipment. Now, remember we talked about 3 key items in the scope of 17025, and those 3 were impartiality, competency of staff, and consistency of results. So as an assessor or an auditor, you need to keep those 3 things in mind unless there are other measurables that you have in accordance with your management system. So if you see a statement like where applicable or when practicable and so on and so forth like that, you have to go back to yourself and ask, is by not doing that going to adversely impact the competency of my staff, cause a risk to impartiality, or a risk to consistent results? And that's where you have to have some system knowledge to understand what the magnitude of that impact of not doing it will be upon the organization. And so what we have seen historically, not A2LA workplace training, but A2LA has seen that people have not been retaining records on firmware and software, where they do have a significant impact on the measurement results in the case of 17025. and where the maintenance plan and the maintenance will also impact that. So let's take a look at identifying the equipment, software, and firmware version. So if I'm looking at the software and firmware version, suppose they made an update and it changed the sampling frequency because of the way which was gathering data from the piece of equipment and generating spectral information, okay? Or repeatability and reproducibility data because you have to take 10 measurements or something like that. And it didn't take the proper counting into effect. And so the OEM, original equipment manufacturer, updated the software to make sure, and the firmware to make sure that it captured the sampling rate, because it was causing a lot of failures where it should have been passes, or a lot of passes that should have been failures. Okay, so they may update corrected or calculations and things like that, and it may just be updates that have to do with the communication rates and the updates to Microsoft and all these other kinds of things. But you need to understand that those updates, firmware and software, can impact your measurements. So you need to understand what that is and make sure that you have records to demonstrate that you've evaluated that. Whatever that looks like. 17025 is agnostic on how you do it, just that you do it. Okay, so where might you find this information? Well, you can find some of these software and firmware updates because sometimes if it's hooked up to the Ethernet or it's hooked up to a computer system that has updates that has access to it, it'll tell you on booting sometimes or startup of those particular pieces of equipment. Or as part of the print report or the exporting of data that goes to a laboratory information management system. Also APIs, or these are these handshake procedures or processes that work between different platforms, like equipment software like Agilent Life Sciences exports data into its own software system, or you decide, you know what, I'm not going to use Agilent's program or Shimadzu's or whatever. I'm going to pull it out and do some data mining of my own and some calculations to look at things that I'm going to do. So whatever it is that you do, that API or that handshake software has to be validated. And if you're updating that API, then those things need to be taken into account. And then, of course, from the old version of the standard, calculations and data transfers. Now, equipment records also talks about reference materials. And I said that we are finding some, A2A is finding some struggles with the reference materials, and that the acceptance criteria has not been recorded. Okay, or relevant dates or periods of validity are not recorded. Now, I see a lot of people in laboratories where they document that in logbooks, okay, but again, the key here is making sure that that information is available wherever you're storing it, if it's in the LIMS system, you know, an electronic LIMS system, or it's in a paper-based LIMS system, and anything in between. So if you're looking at the acceptance criteria, how many times can you open and close this? Do you store this thing in a dark room? Does it have to be stored in a refrigerated area? You can't get above, you know, 25 degrees C, whatever that looks like. So all of these different things that could impact the measurement result, you're ultimately responsible for those records. And again, just like we said before, where are these records? Well, they could be anywhere from paper-based systems where you're keeping paper logbooks next to the workbench, through the network on a hard drive, or in a server in your space, or in a cloud laboratory information management system in the Amazon or Google farm somewhere. Okay. Now, equipment records is the last area that we're going to talk about with respect to maintenance plans. Where I see a lot of laboratories personally breaking down in this area is that they're not documenting maintenance where it's necessary and required. Now here we have an Agilent Life Sciences gas chromatography system with a maintenance schedule in the user's manual. You can also go, in this case, like the AOAC, and you can find similar calibration frequencies and things like that in the back of the ALAC guidance document. But what I've seen people do is not record that they've done the maintenance on these things. And if you don't replace columns and these other consumables, if you will, in these systems, you'll end up getting bad results, okay? And ultimately could damage your machine because you're not doing the maintenance, which is very costly from that perspective, but from a downtime and not being able to provide services to your customers. So does that maintenance system and the maintenance that you're doing impact it? That's the question you need to ask yourself. All right. So next is training competency, 622 and 625. The laboratory shall have procedures and retain records for all 6 of these items that I mentioned before. Now, competence really takes off in section 622 of 17025. So what is competence? Well, competence is what people call the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do something. So when you take all knowledge and skills and you're able to apply them, that's when you're competent, basically. Okay? Now, all 6 of these areas that you see here, the education, qualification, training, technical knowledge, skills, and experience, all contribute to someone's competency level and obviously pay grade, right? But what we need to make sure is that we also include not only the lab personnel in this, but all of those people that ultimately impact the consistency of the result. So that means vendors. So when you go back to 6.6 and you're qualifying vendors, are they competent? Do they follow what we ask them to do, right? And the services and supplies they provide to you. But also, what about your purchasing agents, your customer service, your salespeople, the receiving technicians, the shipping staffing, that all provide the test item back to the customer and the test reports and all the ancillary stuff that have to go back, okay? They will impact the results as well. If you have poor internal auditors, that should be catching a lot of the stuff that is happening and looking at the complaints and not managing the sampling process and setting up a good audit plan and an audit program and a good scope of audit, not the scope of accreditation. That will significantly impact well, it could be the competency issue, but could also impact your customers adversely. So you need to make sure that when you're doing audits, you're not only just doing what's in the lab itself, that's actually doing the work, but those supporting processes. And so what I want to do here in this illustration, and this is just a reproduction of what's in Appendix B of 17025. Oops, let me back up here. I apologize for that. Nope, can't back up. So what I want you to understand is that all of those support processes, all the things in document and data control, all the things in QA, QC that are peripheral processes to the main one of generating the data from the test item, all the way through to sampling of that test item to report generation and delivering that test item back to the customer is all good and dandy, but internal auditing, purchasing services and supplies, contract review, all impact that. And so making sure that you've identified what those competency requirements are necessary to ensure you're getting consistent results. Now, if I were to take all 7 of those attributes from 17025, and you can pull that up and look at them, the first one is competency. So how do you establish and determine competency of an organization? Well, there are several ways and tools that are available for you to do that. You can go to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics Standards Occupational Classification, which is a government website where you can look at and say, you know what, a microbiologist at the analyst level has to have this level of competencies, and this tells you the salary ranges based upon your location. It's a fantastic tool if you're looking to take on a new opportunity where you have to hire new staff where you haven't ventured in that particular area before. You may do the same thing for buying new equipment. If you've never had a nuclear magnetic resonance piece of equipment in your life, it's not a piece, it's a pretty big piece, and all you've been doing is gas chromatography and liquid chromatography, well, guess what? That's a new skill set that you need to bring in. Another way to do it is a SWOT, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and taking a look at what strengths and weaknesses you have in your business unit and saying, all right, well, I need to shore up these weaknesses, so let's go hire outside people to do that. Other tools are like totem poles and 9-boxing. These are just promoting people from within your organization to different roles to evaluate competencies. Those are ways to determine competencies. Now, when you want to onboard somebody, well, what you're going to do is look at resume reviews, interviews, maybe testing, and then you bring them on to hire. Then in C, you have an onboarding process. This is the coaching, teaching, mentoring part of it, from HR, from safety, from the processes in the laboratory, the support processes, on-the-job training, maybe bringing some external trainers to come in to do some work. The D is the supervision component of it, is mentoring and coaching. E is documenting it in the management system. That's authorizing people to do what you say that they're competent to do. And then F is the ongoing monitoring, which is looking at performance reviews, proficiency testing, interlab comparisons, complaints, internal audits, and so on and so forth. So these are just describing that that's a procedure, and that meets the intent of 17025. So competence also refers to the ability for the CAB to authorize personnel for certain activities. And so you need to look at methods, development, modification, verification, validation. All of those require authorizations, as are the results of some of that stuff, the analysis, statements of conformity when something passes or fails in a calibration or a test, making up opinions and interpretations, especially in the forensic space. Report review and authorization all require laboratories to have a record. And so this is all part of the objective evidence things that I would be looking for. Now, one of the things that I do is try and I always like the principle of swing once and slay many, sort of like a sickle when you're going out to cut grass. You can cut many blades of grass with one stroke. And so when I'm looking for authorizations, I coach laboratories when I'm consulting with them to not only use the training, Joe Blow Schmuckatelli came into my lab in 1998 and trained us on internal auditing, and that was it, okay? Very rarely is any training stagnant. And so I look for other areas where I can demonstrate that training was performed. And these 7 items that you see here in front of you, like training records, looking at control charts, are demonstrating that there's consistency. Okay, well, that's ongoing training, if you will. And when something goes wrong and you have to, like that one lady I was telling you about earlier, and you bring them back in, that's training. So you update the training record to demonstrate that we've trained on how to change out a probe or check a probe for making sure that it is a good probe versus a bad probe. Type A studies, which are repeatability, reproducibility, statistical process control, measurement systems analysis, all those fun buzzwords. Uncertainty budgets are another way you can demonstrate that somebody is competent. Scopes of accreditation, so assessments. You can update training records every time you have an assessment if somebody went through that process. Customer audits, internal audits. If they're doing verifications and validations, that's one way. And then internal audits and adjusting intervals accordingly. Now, document control is the next one. And this is where software like Qualtrics comes in very nicely, where they have revisioning control and they have authorizations, and it's available on your cell phone. All kinds of fun stuff that these EQMSs are available to you. IndieSoft, which is a calibration process manager tool. SharePoint, which is the one on the big S here. Many of you are probably familiar with. But then you have paper-based systems. All of them are considered laboratory information management systems. Doesn't have to be electronics in accordance with 17025. All right. So what does that look like? Well, paper-based systems. These are the 6 requirements that documenting your or controlling your documents in your system require of you. I'm not going to get into those because you can read them. However, in paper-based systems, you typically find a title page, a header and footer with all kinds of signatures. They're reviewed and updated by, again, these same authorized signatures and so on and so forth. Identified changes are either through endnotes in the table, strike-throughs, or highlights. They're controlled in distribution. Sometimes they have ledgers. Sometimes they're managed on a network, and any printed copy is controlled, and they manage it through Excel, whatever that looks like. Documents are alphanumerically oriented, like SOP A or S for shipping, and then O1 for the sequence. Okay, that's typically how that's done. And then they're either stamped or watermarked with a physical stamp or an electronic stamp, that you can put in Microsoft Word or Excel. Now, network or cloud systems all pretty much operate the same way. They just have different ways of recording this stuff, and a lot of people forget this, which is why we're kind of coaching you here. So you can store in the general section of the properties of in this case it was a checklist that I had. You can store it you can share it, which gives people authorizations to view it where appropriate. You can set up the security for people to have read-write abilities to it or view and edit, and then you can track the previous versions in it. So this is just in Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel and PowerPoint. You can manage all revision control and authorizations and everything else like that in there. all the way up through things like Qualtrics or IndySoft, where you have versioning control that allows for administrative permissions, check in, check out, versioning control. You can control everything that's going on within the software platform and everything that you need to do there. So whatever system you have as a LIMS, you can use to be successful in managing your documents. Now, again, what happens with external documents? How do you manage that? Well, like A2LA, ANAB, or somebody, or AOAC comes up with some new documents, TNI. How do you manage that? Okay, here it says that you need to consider the impact on the management system, external issues relevant to the laboratory. Again, all the context that I was telling you about. Because if they make it like when ILAC P14 came out with respect to measurement uncertainty and P10 came out with traceability, well, guess what? That flows right down through the accrediting bodies and to your lab near you. Well, what happens when those things change and you haven't caught up to date with those? Well, guess what? A nonconformity is sitting at your desk, right? So how do you manage that? Well, some solutions exist now where you can use hyperlinks. That's perfectly acceptable in the accreditation world. You can use direct hyperlinks in the QMS documents to external documents, if you will. You can bookmark providers on your network system. You can link through an eQMS, and that's one of the nice things about Qualtrics is that you can send links out and it externally links directly back into the Qualtrics so that you have current documents. And it also escalates for periodic review so that you don't forget to review those documents. And then you can also have subscription-based notifications in case you need to go that route as well. And with that, that takes us right up to an hour of the webinar. Again, I want to thank Qualtrics for allowing me to do this, and thank you for being willing to sit in and hear a little bit of insider view on managing risk with respect to nonconformities and looking at it from an assessor point of view. And with that, I want to thank you again. I hope you have a fantastic time in the rest of the user conference. I'm sure you will, because I always have a blast when I'm there. Hopefully the next go round we'll be doing this in person. All right, take care.